So, hello everyone. I'm Hannes Müller and I'm presenting together with Margarita Philipp. I will start now to share my slides and we take it from there. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to post them into the chat. And I hope everybody can see my slides. I should have loaded now. Okay, perfect. So we're going to present the dynamic early warning and action model. This is work together with Christopher Rao, Alessandra Ruggeri, and Ben Simon. And Margarita recently joined the team and has done the remarkable job of reading up on the entire model and now understands it and will present part of the model as well. I will start out to give an overview. The dynamic early warning action model is a framework that integrates machine learning and dynamic programming. Dynamic programming is a method that is used in economics a lot to optimize dynamically decision making. And so what we are really trying to do here is to bring forecasts into a decision making problem. So we're therefore combining the machine learning and dynamic programming worlds. And so the goal here is to give policymakers something that allows them to build their own priority list with very transparent assumptions and very transparent ways of doing these and generating these priority lists. And since we're using a forecast, it should also allow policymakers to kind of act earlier and build an evidence base for prevention. And so I'm going to illustrate that today with a specific set of assumptions we make on the model and show you what the result is. So the context for the DWAM is that for this model is that I think we are all still, this is not from us, this is from a think tank called FP21. We're all still doing a lot of analytical work with forecasting early warning methods, but we are not using them to do actual early warning as defined by forecasts are embedded into early warning systems focused on high priority areas, or even to evaluate the likelihood of certain policies. So I think most organizations are using forecasting systems as an analytical tool, but they haven't been integrated into decision making. And so what we really try to contribute to is to bring forecasts deeper into the decision making stream. And that's really an attempt of doing that. So just before we start to get into the model, I would like to talk about a really important problem that policymakers that are engaged in preventative action face. Namely that peaceful countries tend to stay peaceful, but they might still fall into the conflict trap. The conflict trap is a really important aspect of violent armed conflict, which is that countries that are violent stay violent. Countries that were recently violent also have a very, very likelihood of falling back into violence. Right, so that's one part of the coin. The other side of the coin is that you have peaceful countries that most likely stay peaceful, but we really want to prevent those peaceful countries from falling into the trap because it's very hard to get out, right? So there's this energy levels almost that where you have when you're peaceful, you're likely to stay peaceful, but once you're having on this sliding surface that pulls you back into the trap, it's very hard to escape it, right? And so conflict forecast, what our group does, it specializes in defining these risks systematically, these risks that peaceful countries face. So the kind of before you have this sliding into conflict, we're trying to, as good as we can, identify those risks. But the problem there is it's very low risk. And actually, there's not that many onsets that the machine learning model can learn from. There's not that many outbreaks of violence in very peaceful countries. And so the machine doesn't have a very, very, very easy time to do that. And so our forecasts are not ultra precise, right? We're not talking about the minority report here. We're talking about like an approximation of how unstable or stable you are. And that generates a lot of false positives. So the policymakers take our forecasts and they act upon them. They will act in many, many situations where nothing would have happened anyway, right? Because it's very low risk, and we're trying to identify the risks that are higher risk, but still this risk is fairly low, right? And so you are having a problem here, because on the one hand, you have a very, very dark future that you have once you have fallen into the trap. It's very hard to escape this. So the benefit of falling into the trap is huge. On the other side, you're wasting a lot of resources by trying to act very early. So the question we are asking in this model is, how early do you want to act, given that these are the contraring different things that pull you? One side is the conflict trap. Once you're in there, it's very costly. And the other thing is like you're wasting resources if you're acting too early. Now, this is a high-level overview of the model. It's very, very, there's a lot of machinery in here and a lot of different steps. They're all quite complicated. Most of you might not understand all the words that are written on these slides. I just want to give you a broad overview. So we first take our forecast. This is coming from our machine learning method. It's also using news text. And in the last conference last year, Christoph and I presented that method. And then we define risk stages. And we're using these forecasts together with other data to distinguish 12 kind of situations in the conflict cycle. This is done with, for those who understand, this is done with a hidden Markov model. And then we link those stages to outcomes. We run regression analysis, kind of causal analysis of like how bad are these stages, what costs, what damages are associated with them. And then we simulate interventions once we have the entire model set into place, right? We have the dynamics of the system, we have how damaging conflict is, we have a policy that you're intervening with to change the course of the dynamics. And so this would give us then an answer, which is like, when should you intervene in this trade-off between acting early and acting late? So just to kind of illustrate more or less the idea of these stages of the model is that to solve a dynamic model where every point in time you can think about whether you should intervene now or you wait a little longer and intervene later, and then if something happens you can still intervene and do something, right? We need to solve this this kind of cycle where you have a stage, you take an action, this affects the environment, and then the environment gives you a certain reward in terms of damages. And so in order to solve that as a dynamic programming model, we need the stages and their dynamics, the transition function between these stages. We need actions that you can take, and we need rewards. And so what I'm going to do today, together with Margarita, is to talk you through these different aspects of the model. But let me first start talking a little bit about what these stages are. So once we have kind of fed our forecasting series into this hidden Markov model, that is like some algorithm that's making sense of it, it's basically coming out are like 12 stages. We chose it to be 12 stages, and they are ordered from very far away from conflict. So these are, Sweden most of the time is here, and Germany, to like very high, very intense conflict. So these is like, the Syrian civil war and its height. And so what we do here is to kind of categorize for you using just for now the forecast into different groups. So you have, from very low forecasted likelihood on average in these groups to very high, right? And so what you see here is basically what we do is like we categorize them and give names to them. So this is stable peace for us, very low risk overall, right? Up maximum 14%. Then we have an elevated risk group. These are countries that are either having events taking place that make them more risky, or they just recently come out of conflict. So that's mostly for stages 7, 8, 9, and 10. These are mostly post-conflict stages. And then we have the conflict-affected stages where the risk is, of course, very high, but you see also the fatalities numbers are now very, very high here. Now, the observed fatalities are here. So these are the fatality numbers. Why am I marking 5 and 6? Because 5 and 6 are exactly the kind of cases that we really want to focus on. These are peaceful countries that have been peaceful for a long time, but they're in stages 5 and 6 because their forecast here is fairly high. Our forecasting system says within the 12 months, you're probably going to have an outbreak of some likelihood. 20% doesn't sound that dangerous, but if you compare that to the baseline level, which is below 1%, this is definitely an area of heightened risk. right? And so if I could ask you something, is like, watch out what's going to happen in stages 5 and 6. Like, is it worth intervening in these? Is the policy function telling us something about whether you want to at all intervene in these stages, even though they didn't have a conflict in a long time? So now I'm going to hand over to Margarita.
Great, thank you so much. So what I'll take you through in the next almost 10 minutes is the transition matrix that Hannes just spoke about, then the different damages that are associated with being in the different stages, and then the costs of intervening. And then at the end, we'll put it all together and look at what the simulation then tells us about where returns to intervening are the highest. Next slide, please. So this is just a nice visualization to illustrate what the transition matrix does. So on the left-hand side, we have the stage at time t, right? So which stage is a country currently in? And on the x-axis, we have the stage that the country could be in 3 periods time. And then what the color gradient tells us is how likely is that transition to take place. And you can see that the darkest color is along the diagonal, which essentially just means that countries are most likely to stay in the same stage in 3 months' time. But there is some probability that it will escalate, so it will end up in a stage further to the right, or it will de-escalate, so end up in a stage further to the left. Next slide, please. And then in the bottom right-hand corner is just the conflict trap that Hannes was speaking about, right? So once a country reaches a high stage, is in a high stage at time t, it's quite likely that it will stay in an adjacent stage, that it will stay in another stage. There's some chance that it will de-escalate more over time, but more likely it will stay in a high conflict stage. Brilliant. Next slide, please. So now that we've got the conceptualization of these stages and we've worked out the probabilities from the data of how likely a country is to move along the stages in different directions, we can link the stages to different outcomes, which we speak of as damages. Next slide, please. And we focus on 4 particular damages. So how much is GDP growth affected, fatalities, refugees, and official development assistance. So here are the steps we go through using OLS regressions to calculate the, so we calculate the change in these 4 outcomes associated with each stage. For the fatalities and refugees, we then have to convert that to monetary damages, so estimating how much it takes to support refugees, and how and then for fatalities, we use the value of a statistical life. Having calculated the damages, then we can simulate the future path of damages with the transition matrix, right? Because we have a number, we have a probability of how likely a country is to escalate and de-escalate. So we get the future discounted damage of being in an at-risk stage, and this dynamic looking forward changes what we perceive as bad. And this is the essence of what we're presenting today, because in a moment I'll show you what the static view looks like, which is perhaps how policymakers view the world now. And then we'll look at what the dynamic damages look like. So next slide, please. So this is the static view. And you can see on the right-hand side, we're only looking at the damages associated with fatalities. So of course, only stages 11 and 12, which have the high numbers of fatalities, show up as having high damages, right? So it's super visible that this country is in trouble. And on the left-hand side, we also include GDP. And if you, for example, look at stage 9, it doesn't look like there's much damage happening. So if you just look at that country, look around, there's not much happening. But when we move to the dynamic view on the next slide, you can see this is perhaps a more realistic view of the world, where the potential damages in the current stage depend on how likely it is that I go into other stages in future. And so now stage 9 looks a lot more risky, because being in stage 9 means you're already quite close to stages 10, 11, and 12, which are then visibly hard to be in. Exactly. So that's the dynamic. So that's the dynamic view. Next slide, please. And now finally, so just now I've been using the word of damages. So how bad is it to be in a stage? And now using the word cost, I describe intervention. So first we'll look at the effectiveness of intervention, and then we'll look at the cost of intervention. Next slide, please. So this is probably the mathematically most nitty-gritty slide. We won't go into the details, but I'm happy to answer more questions. In effect, the way we model interventions is to say we're shifting probability mass. So for each stage, there's some amount of probability, right, from the transition matrix associated with being in the stage or staying in the stage, moving to higher stages and moving to lower stages. And so what we're saying a policy does is it either increases or decreases the probability of being in a stage. And as you'd expect, so the decrease here is in red, an effective policy should lead to a decrease in higher stages and an increase in probability of lower stages on the bottom left-hand corner. So here we've modeled it with 25%, and the beauty of this approach is that we can model it with different levels of policy effectiveness, and so we'll see that later. We modeled between 2 and 25%. I think the key thing to take away here is that the amount of probability mass shifted depends on two things. One, how effective do we assume the policy to be? So how much probability mass gets shifted, and then also the relative amount of probability mass above and below the current stage. So that's about modeling the effectiveness of the policy. And now we want to model cost. And for cost, there are two key things that we take into consideration. One is just a fixed cost per capita. So that's the same across all countries. That's a simplification for now. That could be changed in future iterations. And also a variable cost. And the variable cost is driven by fatalities. So the only assumption really we're making here is to say, well, in places where conflict is already ongoing and there are fatalities right now, it is more costly to intervene because there might be military intervention required, or anyone going there requires more protection, etc. So that's the only assumption really we're making here. And the variations we can make of that assumption is just how much variable cost that adds to intervention. So here we're modeling with $10,000, $40,000, and $200,000 per ongoing fatality. And unsurprisingly, the stages associated with the most fatalities, so in this case, 11 and 12, have the highest cost, which is driven by this variable component. And stage 8 has that bump because it's also associated with more fatalities. Next slide, please. So now we have everything in place, as Hannes was describing earlier. For dynamic programming, we need the stages and how likely we are to transition between them. So we've got the 12 stages and the transition matrix. We have our action, which is to intervene or not to intervene. So not intervening just means that the probabilities stay exactly the same. Intervening means we're shifting the probability mass by our assumed amount. And then finally, we have the rewards. So we have the gains associated with avoiding damages, and we have the cost of intervening. And from this, we can simulate optimal policies with these different assumptions, which is, of course, solved recursively in dynamic programming. And then at the end of the day, we have two things that we can give to policymakers, for example, and we can say, okay, this is the action value, right? So these are your gains minus the cost. Or we can think of it as a benefit cost ratio, where we divide the gains by the cost. And it's this latter one that we're looking at. So effectively, you can interpret the numbers as the returns on each dollar spent on intervention. So next slide, please. So here you've got the stages again listed down the left-hand side. As a reminder, stable, peace, elevated risk, and conflict affected countries. And then at the top, we're working with the different assumptions. So some of the things that we said we could tweak. Assumption 1, variable costs of intervention, right? How much more does it cost to intervene, depending on fatalities and the expected success rate of the policy. Next slide. And we often work with the assumption of the 5%. And in essence, I mean, there's a lot of numbers on the slide, but the key message here is that the greatest returns are the dark green boxes, and they appear in the elevated risk group. And this makes intuitive sense because the costs are more manageable, right? Because there aren't many or any fatalities. So the variable cost doesn't kick in. And we have high gains from avoiding the stages with the worst impact, right? Those ones at the high end of the scale. Whereas in stable peace, the probability of escalating to such a bad stage is much lower. Next slide, please. And then just to visualize that with data from Nigeria, You can see two peaks here in the returns to intervention, one at stage 9 and one at stage 6. And there's just one key thing I want to point out here, because you can see that the returns go down drastically for stages 11 and 12, which makes sense because in our model, we're assuming that intervening where there's lots of fatalities is very, very costly. However, what we're not saying is that these countries should not receive support. We might want to intervene with humanitarian aid. We're just saying that early intervention is no longer as effective in those stages. And with that, I hand back to Hannes.
Yes, thank you. So what we do on conflictforecast.org, if you go to our webpage, conflictforecast.org, you see a new panel that now is called Prevention Gains. And in that, we explain this method again. And we also give you an updated list that we update every month, assuming this 5% effectiveness assumption, our ranking of countries. And we do this with GDP inside the model and without GDP, where we just, without GDP, we model the a number of dollars spent on ODA and humanitarian and rebuilding efforts and fatalities and, the number of refugees. And so the ranking that I'm going to show you here now, so this is like the ranking that we also provide on the webpage, is driven by these last two columns, right? And we order countries by how much our model says you get by intervening with $1. And so, of course, this list, this is a model. This is a, it's an abstraction. It's something that, not everybody might like every list, every country here. But what I would like to point out is that this list is very different in terms of policy preference that this embodies than the usual list of fragile countries, right? Fragile conflict-affected countries would yield a very different list than this one. Or some overlap is there, but most countries here on this list are quite different. And so this is what we really think is our contribution to kind of shift the attention to a set of countries that might have a recent conflict, are stabilizing right now, where there's a lot of engagement by the international community. Or there might have, there might be lots of dollars saved if we bring these countries to stability per dollar spent, right? So again, we're not saying that there should be no humanitarian response to the disaster that civil war is, but what we are saying is that there's really a very much more effective way of spending dollars in the preventative approach when you're trying to change the course of a conflict by mediation or through offering help. That you might spend your money. And so basically, let me conclude with this. So the lists we provide are obviously not without problems, right? There's many assumptions on interventions that are necessary to make these lists. Not all damage assumptions are taken into account, right? So you might model international trade or human rights violations and other things that right now are not inside the model. And then, of course, feasibility of policies are not modeled in detail. We just say, the cost of an intervention, the cost of doing something, changing the course of the conflict is much harder when there's a lot of fatalities on the ground already. I think that's a very reasonable assumption. But of course, the Iran example on the previous slide, of course, makes clear that, it's probably not very feasible always to do something from outside. And then it's based on the Markov model, which might be or might not be a good fit to some of the circumstances we're describing. But even all that taken into account, we think that this model makes the cost and gains assumptions very explicit. We can talk about them, we can pull them into the open, and we can analyze robustness to these assumptions. And we have done that to some extent. And the results that we found are more or less the same, very robust to what kind of changing some of the details. And I think that this can really complement existing lists like the fragile and conflict-affected countries by the World Bank, because it's really like it aims much more at the preventative approach to policy. And so we think it has two advantages based on an explicit policy goal. You're really modeling exactly what you're trying to achieve, and it's built in with a forecast. So it has a forward-looking approach that was very clear, I hope, with the dynamic versus static view. And it allows you to explicitly trade off the cost of false positive and the cost conflict. And I think surprisingly, or I think quite interestingly, you saw that stages 5 and 6 and 7 were fairly high when compared to where usually nowadays the attention is. And so this is where I stop, and we open the floor for questions. So maybe let's look at the chat. I don't know whether. Okay. Are there any questions? Okay, everybody's happy. Or logged off. Should we go into detail on any of the things we talked about? Is there any? Oh, thank you, Peter. maybe I'd use this comment to just quickly talk about our web page. Actually, it's a good idea. So let me quickly change tabs because I do have it. I should have it ready at least. Can't do it right now. Yeah, here we go. I can't see it myself right now because of the tab. There we go. So this is the conflict forecast webpage, and what you see here is the overall evaluation we give to countries to risk of an outbreak. And if you click on a country, say Tunisia, we give you the timeline of the outbreak risk as it was seen by our model at the time and place. So for example, if you look at here, it's September the 1st, that's the August 2013 data we used to forecast, and it said at this point in time that the outbreak likelihood was 51% according to the best model, what we call the best model. We have 3 different models and always 2 submodels. So it's the armed conflict outbreak, any violence outbreak, and violence intensity forecast, and the 3 ahead and further ahead. And so we have a best model and a text model. And what's interesting here is that the text model, which is driven by the news text, reacts slightly earlier, sees basically this outbreak happening, but then stays flat, whereas the armed conflict outbreak model keeps increasing into the terror campaign that then took place in Tunisia, right? But what the model also talks about is basically stabilization. You see like a kind of stabilization, at least on the conflict dimension now for Tunisia. And so we use a topic model that is used to generate these forecasts. Are there any other questions? We're playing.
So there's a couple of questions. I think the first one I already started to answer, which is the assumption about the cost of fatalities. So we're trying to proxy how much more expensive it is to intervene in a country with ongoing conflict. And so one way to do that is to just say, well, for each person dying, each battle-related death kind of increases the cost of intervention in that country. So if there are 50 people dying in that country, then we increase the variable cost by 50 times 200,000 or 50 times 400,000, depending which assumption we're working with. I hope that answers that question. And about the ranking in the last slide, so the ranking we do without GDP data. And the reason for that is because countries that are wealthy, so that have a higher GDP per capita, would come up as having really quite high damages, right? If a really wealthy country, I think Brazil might be a relatively wealthier country, enters conflict and the GDP reduces, then that would affect a lot of people, right? In the case of Brazil. So then Brazil might just rank really highly, even though it has a slightly lower risk, for example, of actually ending up in conflict. So that's maybe why the ranking isn't obvious, but if you look at the last 2 columns, that's what it's actually ranked by. And then, Hannes, do you want to take the next one? There was one about, are the 1%, 5%, and 10% options confidence intervals?
1 second.
I'm wondering if that's related to the policy effectiveness, the 2%.
Yes, no, this,
5%.
we never talk about confidence intervals, Rob. Here we have confidence intervals on all these things. We have standard deviation, everything is calculated. But the 1%, 5%, and 10% means the effectiveness of the policy. And so 2% means that with 98% likelihood your policy fails to shift the probability mass around. And so that's basically where these percentage numbers come from. That's based on assumptions. But yeah, we don't talk about confidence intervals here. We have them, of course. The regressions have confidence intervals. The damages, we simulate these transition paths, and all these generate confidence intervals, which we don't report now for simplicity, but of course we have them. Exactly, Anya, a very good question. So we are forecasting 3 different things: armed conflict, any violence, and intensity of conflict. So what you should do if you care about Congo, the DRC, is to look at the intensity forecast, because that's the most interesting thing to look at for countries that are in conflict, right? Because they already have their outbreak, right? And therefore all the risks are always at 90%, right? We always ask, for example, did you see the Israeli escalation now coming? And we had Israel for outbreaks, we always had it at 90%. And of course, that's not a very interesting statement. It has been at 90% throughout. And this is for most countries that are in conflict, this is exactly where our forecast is. You can also switch to the prevention view. And the prevention view kind of puts into gray all the countries that our model says are in conflict. And so then it kind of focuses the mind a little bit more on what we think are the more preventative cases. Some of them really had a very recent conflict. So they're very, very high risk. So the dark red ones in the prevention view are the ones that just came out of conflict. And so it's not completely rid of the conflict trap, but you know, I think that's kind of one way to focus the map and focus our minds here. But yes, we also track the intensity forecast.
Maybe just to clarify, the target variable in the intensity are the number of deaths per 100,000 people. So we're actually just trying to forecast how many people are likely to die in battle. Okay, great. I think we're at time. Please don't hesitate to reach out to either of us if you do have any further questions on Twitter, LinkedIn, or through the website.
Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you all for coming.